Officer Daniels had been a policeman for over 15 years. He was known for being strict and tough, always following the rules as he saw fit. But deep inside, he carried a mindset that had been shaped by years of personal experiences and beliefs. He believed he could always tell when someone was up to no good, and he rarely second-guessed himself. That night, as he sat in his patrol car near the hospital, he noticed a woman walking toward her car in the parking lot. It was late, the streets were quiet, and something about the situation made him suspicious. Dr. Aisha Carter had just finished a long shift at the hospital. Her feet were aching, her body was tired, and all she wanted was to go home, take a warm shower, and rest. She had spent the last 12 hours saving lives, helping people, and making difficult medical decisions. But as she reached for her car keys, she heard a voice behind her. "Hey, stop right there." Startled, she turned around and saw a police officer walking toward her. His face was stern, his posture aggressive. She immediately felt uneasy but remained calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked politely, though her heart was beginning to race. Daniels narrowed his eyes, looking at her with suspicion. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. Aisha frowned. "I work here. I'm a doctor. I'm just heading home." Daniels wasn't convinced. He had seen too many cases where people lied to get out of trouble. His instincts told him something wasn't right. Ignoring her words, he asked for her ID. Aisha, though frustrated, reached into her bag and handed it to him. As he examined the ID, doubt crept into his mind. Everything seemed correct. Yet he still didn't trust her. His years on the force had made him believe that some people just didn't belong in certain places, and unfortunately, he judged Aisha unfairly in that moment. "Are you sure this is real?" he asked, his voice sharp. Aisha felt a wave of anger rise inside her. She had worked so hard to become a doctor, dedicating her life to helping others, and now she was being treated like a criminal for no reason. She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Officer, if you just check with the hospital, they'll confirm who I am," she said firmly. But Daniels wasn't listening. Instead of calling to verify, he assumed she was being uncooperative. His tone became harsher, his actions more forceful. Aisha couldn't believe what was happening. She had done nothing wrong, yet she found herself in a terrifying situation. A few people nearby started noticing the scene, some taking out their phones. Her heart pounded as she realized that this moment could change everything. And it did. Within hours, the video of the encounter spread online, sparking outrage. People demanded answers. And Officer Daniels, who had always been so sure of his judgment, had no idea that his world was about to turn upside down. The morning after the incident, Officer Daniels woke up to an unusual number of missed calls and messages. His phone kept buzzing, and when he finally picked it up, he saw that his name was all over the news. Confused, he turned on the television. What he saw made his stomach tighten. The video of his encounter with Dr. Aisha Carter was being played on every major news channel. The footage showed him stopping her in the parking lot, questioning her aggressively, and refusing to believe her even after she showed her ID. The clip ended with the moment he dismissed her explanation and acted unfairly. Daniels frowned as he watched. He had been in difficult situations before, but this was different. People were angry. On social media, thousands of comments called for action to be taken against him. His name was trending for all the wrong reasons. A knock on his door made him jump. It was his supervisor. The officer's face was serious as he stepped inside. "We need to talk," he said. Daniels followed him to the station, where he was told he would be placed on temporary leave while an investigation took place. "This is bigger than you think," his supervisor warned. "The hospital has confirmed Dr. Carter's identity. She's a respected doctor. The public is demanding answers, and the department has to respond." Daniels sat quietly, his mind racing. He had always believed he was just doing his job, but now, for the first time, he began to wonder if he had been wrong. Meanwhile, Dr. Aisha Carter was struggling with her own emotions. She had worked so hard to build her career, pushing through challenges and proving herself again and again. And yet, one night, one encounter, had made her feel powerless. She didn't want to be in the news. She didn't want to be known as a victim. But as she saw the messages of support flooding in, she realized this was about more than just her. People were sharing their own experiences, their own frustrations, and she knew she couldn't stay silent. At the hospital, her colleagues checked on her, offering kind words and encouragement. "You didn't deserve that," one of the nurses said. "We all know who you are and how hard you work." Aisha nodded, trying to stay strong. But deep inside, she was exhausted, not just from the incident, but from the weight of everything it represented. Back at home, Officer Daniels scrolled through the comments online. He saw messages from people calling him unfair, calling him part of a bigger problem. He wanted to defend himself, to say he had only been doing his job. But then he saw a comment from a fellow officer that made him pause. "You messed up, Daniels. You need to face it." For the first time in a long while, Daniels felt unsure of himself. Had he really judged Aisha unfairly? Had he let his own beliefs cloud his judgment? As he sat in his quiet home, far from the badge and uniform that had given him a sense of control, he felt something he wasn't used to: doubt. And with that doubt came a question he couldn't ignore. What if he had been wrong all along? Dr. Aisha Carter sat in her office at the hospital, staring at her phone. It had been ringing nonstop since the incident. Reporters wanted interviews, community leaders wanted her to speak at events, and people she had never met were sending messages of support. She appreciated their kindness, but she didn't want to be in the spotlight. She just wanted to do her job. Still, the memory of that night wouldn't leave her. No matter how much she tried to focus on her patients, the moment kept replaying in her mind. The doubt in Officer Daniels' eyes, the way he had dismissed her words, and the frustration of being treated unfairly despite doing nothing wrong. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Dr. Patel, her senior colleague and mentor. He walked in and gave her a sympathetic look. "How are you holding up?" he asked gently. Aisha sighed. "I'm okay, I guess. Just tired of all the attention." Dr. Patel nodded. "I understand. But sometimes things happen for a reason. Maybe this moment is bigger than just you." Aisha knew he was right. She had spent years dealing with unfair treatment in small ways, brushing it off, choosing to focus on her work instead. But now, people were paying attention. Maybe this was a chance to make a real difference. Meanwhile, Officer Daniels sat at home, feeling trapped in his own thoughts. He hadn't left the house in days, avoiding the stares and whispers from neighbors. He was used to people respecting him, but now it felt like the world was against him. His phone rang again. It was his partner from the station, Officer Riley. "You should talk to her," Riley said as soon as Daniels picked up. Daniels frowned. "Talk to who?" "Dr. Carter. You need to hear her side. You need to understand what you did." Daniels hesitated. He wasn't sure he was ready for that conversation, but deep down, he knew he couldn't ignore it forever. Later that evening, he found himself searching for more information about Dr. Carter. He read about her journey, how she had worked hard to become a doctor, how she had dedicated her life to saving people. The more he read, the more he realized how unfairly he had treated her. For the first time, guilt started to replace his defensiveness. He had been so sure of himself that night, but now he wasn't so sure anymore. A few days later, Dr. Carter received an unexpected message. It was from Officer Daniels. "I know I was wrong. I'd like to talk if you're willing." Aisha stared at the message, unsure how to feel. Was he truly sorry? Did she even want to hear what he had to say? She took a deep breath. This wasn't just about her anymore. Maybe, just maybe, this conversation could lead to something bigger than an apology. Dr. Aisha Carter sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the message from Officer Daniels. She read it again and again, unsure of how to respond. A part of her wanted to ignore it. After all, What could he possibly say that would change what had already happened? But another part of her was curious. Was he truly sorry, or was this just another attempt to protect himself? She sighed and placed her phone on the nightstand. It had been a long day at the hospital, and her mind was already exhausted. Maybe she would think more clearly in the morning. The next day, as she walked into work, she found her thoughts drifting back to the message. She decided to mention it to Dr. Patel. "He wants to meet," Dr. Patel asked, surprised. Aisha nodded. "He says he knows he was wrong and wants to talk." Dr. Patel leaned back in his chair. "And what do you want to do?" Aisha hesitated. "I don't know. Part of me wants to hear what he has to say. But another part of me feels like, why should I have to listen? He's the one who hurt me." Dr. Patel nodded in understanding. "That's a fair question. But sometimes, hearing someone out isn't just for them. It's for you too. Maybe this is a chance for him to truly understand, and for you to say everything you've wanted to say." Aisha thought about that for a moment. She had spent so much time feeling frustrated and unheard. Maybe this was her opportunity to make him listen. That evening, she finally replied, "I'll meet with you. But I need to know, are you truly here to listen, or just to clear your name?" Daniels read the message, feeling a nervous weight settle in his chest. He had asked himself the same question. Why did he want this meeting? Was it just guilt, or was it something deeper? He typed back, "I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to understand." Aisha wasn't sure if she believed him, but she agreed to meet. They chose a quiet cafe, away from the crowds and cameras. The day of the meeting, Daniels arrived early. He sat at a small table, his hands tapping nervously on the cup of coffee in front of him. When Aisha finally walked in, he felt his stomach tighten. She looked strong, confident, nothing like the vulnerable person he had unfairly judged that night. She sat down across from him, her face unreadable. There was a long silence before she finally spoke. "Why did you want to meet?" Daniels took a deep breath. "Because I was wrong, and I need to understand why I was wrong." Aisha studied him carefully. "Do you really want to understand, or are you just saying that?" Daniels met her eyes. "I need to understand, because if I don't, I'll never change." For the first time, Aisha saw something in his expression she hadn't expected. Not just guilt, but the desire to be better. Maybe, just maybe, this conversation was worth having. Aisha took a deep breath and looked across the table at Officer Daniels. She had spent the last few days preparing for this moment, thinking about what she wanted to say. But now that she was here, face to face with the man who had humiliated her, she wasn't sure where to begin. Daniels shifted in his seat, clearly nervous. He wasn't used to feeling this way. As a police officer, he was always in control, always giving orders. But here, in this small cafe, he felt like a student about to be taught a lesson he should have learned a long time ago. "I want to start by saying I'm sorry," he said. His voice was quieter than she had expected. "I know those words aren't enough, but I need to say them." Aisha nodded but remained silent. She wanted him to keep talking. She wanted to see if he truly understood what he had done. Daniel sighed and ran a hand over his face. "That night, I thought I was doing my job. I thought I was stopping someone suspicious. But when I watched the video, I saw it differently. I saw how I refused to listen, how I dismissed everything you said. And it made me wonder, how many times have I done that before?" Aisha's eyes narrowed. "That's the real question, isn't it? How many times have you treated someone unfairly without even realizing it?" Daniels looked down, ashamed. "Too many, I think. And that scares me." Aisha leaned forward. "Do you know why that night hurt me so much? It wasn't just about you not believing me. It was about what it represented. I've spent my entire life working twice as hard to prove myself. I became a doctor because I wanted to help people. But in that moment, none of it mattered. You didn't see a doctor. You saw a suspect." Daniel swallowed hard. He had never thought about it that way. Aisha continued, her voice steady but firm. You had power over me that night. I was tired. I was vulnerable, and you could have listened, but you didn't. And that's what so many people are tired of. We're tired of not being believed. We're tired of being treated like we don't belong. Daniels felt a lump in his throat. He had always seen himself as a fair officer, someone who did his job with honor. But now he realized fairness wasn't just about following the law. It was about truly seeing people for who they were. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said after a long pause. But I don't want this to end here. I want to do better. I want to learn. Aisha studied him for a moment, searching for any sign of insincerity. But all she saw was a man who was finally questioning himself, finally willing to change. Words mean nothing without action, she said simply. Daniels nodded. Then tell me where to start. For the first time, Aisha felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe this conversation wouldn't change the past, but perhaps it could change the future. Aisha took a deep breath and looked at Daniels. He seemed sincere, but she knew that change didn't happen just because of one conversation. It required effort, action, and a willingness to truly see the world differently. You want to know where to start? She asked. Start by listening. Really listening. Not just to me, but to others who have had similar experiences. Open your eyes to what's happening around you. Daniels nodded slowly. I thought I was always fair in my job. I followed the rules. But I see now that just following rules isn't enough. I need to change the way I think. Aisha leaned forward. Exactly. You didn't stop me that night because I was doing something wrong. You stopped me because of an idea you had in your head. A wrong idea about who belongs where. Daniel sighed. I see that now. But how do I fix it? Aisha thought for a moment. You fix it by challenging yourself every day. By questioning your own judgments before acting on them. By learning about the struggles of people who don't look like you. By speaking up when you see something wrong, even when it's uncomfortable. Daniels nodded, absorbing her words. I want to do that. But I know words aren't enough. I need to prove it through my actions. Aisha sat back in her chair. She had been skeptical about this meeting, but now she saw a man who was finally ready to understand. Then do it, she said. Show me, show others, that you're willing to change. Daniels knew this wouldn't be easy. Changing the way he thought, admitting his mistakes, and becoming better would take time. But for the first time, he truly wanted to try. The conversation continued for a while longer, with Aisha sharing her experiences and Daniels listening carefully. He asked questions, not to defend himself, but to understand. And for the first time in a long time, Aisha felt heard. As they left the cafe, Daniels turned to her. Thank you for giving me this chance to learn. Aisha nodded. Learning is just the beginning. Now let's see what you do with it. As she walked away, she hoped that their conversation had planted a seed, one that would grow into real change. Over the next few weeks, Officer Daniels found himself looking at the world differently. Every interaction, every decision he made while on duty, now came with a second thought. Was he being fair? Was he listening properly? Was he judging people based on assumptions rather than facts? At the police station, he remained quiet, observing his fellow officers as they spoke. He started noticing things he had ignored before, the way some officers treated people with more suspicion based on their background, the way certain complaints were dismissed too quickly, the way small biases shaped bigger decisions. It made him uncomfortable. He realized he had been a part of this system for years without questioning it. One evening, he was sent to respond to a call at a convenience store. The store owner claimed a young man was acting suspiciously. When Daniels arrived, he saw the young man, a teenager, probably no older than 17, standing near the shelves, looking nervous. A younger Daniels might have immediately assumed the worst. He might have demanded answers in a harsh tone or jumped to conclusions. But today, he approached differently. Hey there, he said calmly. Everything okay? The boy hesitated. Yeah, I was just trying to figure out if I have enough money for what I need. Daniels glanced at the item in his hand, a small pack of medicine. The store owner stood behind the counter, arms crossed. "He's been standing there too long," the man said. "I don't like it." Daniels turned back to the boy. "Do you have enough?" The boy lowered his head. "No, I'm a little short." Without a word, Daniels took out his own wallet and handed the cashier a few bills. "This should cover it." The boy's eyes widened in surprise. You're paying for it." Daniels nodded. "You needed it, right?" The boy nodded quickly, thanked him, and hurried out of the store. The store owner looked annoyed. "You're too trusting," he muttered. Daniels simply shook his head. "Or maybe I just took the time to listen." That night, he thought about Aisha. He hadn't spoken to her since their meeting, but her words had stayed with him. "Now let's see what you do with it." He wanted to tell her that he was trying, that he was changing. Meanwhile, Aisha was still unsure what to think about Daniels. Their conversation had been powerful, but she had seen too many empty apologies before. She knew real change took more than words. Then, one evening, she received a message from an unknown number. "I don't know if you care to hear this, but I wanted to let you know. I listened. I'm learning, and I won't stop." Aisha read the message twice. Then, for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, people could change. Aisha stared at the message on her phone. She had not expected Daniels to reach out again. She had hoped he would take their conversation seriously, but she wasn't sure if he truly would. Now, reading his words, she felt a small sense of relief. Maybe, just maybe, he was different from the others who had apologized but never changed. She thought for a moment before replying. Keep learning. Keep listening. That's how change happens. Daniels smiled when he saw her response. It wasn't a full acceptance, but it was something. A sign that she believed he could do better, if he truly tried. And he would. Over the next few months, Daniels made real efforts to change. He attended community meetings, listening to people's experiences with law enforcement. He had tough conversations with his colleagues at the station, challenging their way of thinking, even when it made him unpopular. Some officers dismissed him, saying he was being too soft. But Daniels no longer cared about proving himself to them. He cared about doing the right thing. One day, a call came in about a disturbance in a neighborhood. When Daniels arrived, he saw two officers questioning an older man outside his own home. The man looked frustrated. "What's going on here?" Daniels asked, stepping in. "He was acting suspicious," one of the officers said. Daniels frowned. "How?" The officer hesitated. "Well, a neighbor called in, saying he was walking around outside late at night." Daniels turned to the man. "Sir, is this your house?" "Yes," the man said firmly. "I was just out getting some air." Daniels sighed. He knew this situation all too well. If he had been the officer from before, he might have ignored the unfairness of it. But not now. "There's no crime in walking outside your own home," Daniels said to his colleagues. "Let's wrap this up." The officers looked at each other, but didn't argue. They walked away, and the man let out a relieved breath. "Thank you, officer," he said. Daniels gave a small nod. "I'm sorry you had to go through that." As he drove back to the station, he thought about how much had changed in just a few months. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying, and that mattered. Later that evening, he sent one last message to Aisha. "I don't expect a friendship, but I want you to know. I hear you, I see you, and I will never stop trying to do better." Aisha read the message and, for the first time since that night, felt a sense of peace. She didn't know if Daniels would always make the right choices, but he was willing to learn. And that, she realized, was how real change began. She put her phone down and smiled. Maybe the world wasn't perfect. Maybe it never would be. But if one person could change, then maybe others could too. And that was enough to give her hope.